This Devar Torah is dedicated to Harry Krebs on his first yurtzeit. And as I noted, his Hebrew name was Yosef. And Yosef is the focus of our Torah reading, and in particular, as a dream interpreter. Page 242, I want to follow along a little. We have Joseph in prison, and he's already working. He's working assigned to a particular cell, which is apparently where the elite are put, and that in this particular space are two courtiers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And in verse 7, we have Joseph speaking to the courtiers. V'yishal et srisei paro. And he asked the courtiers of Pharaoh, Asher ito b'mishmar, that were with him in the confinement, Beit Adonav, his master's house, lemor, saying, Madua penechem ra'im hayom. Why is there something bad in your face this day? V'yomru elav, and they said to him, Chalom chalamta, we have had dreams, ufoter einoto, and there's no one to interpret it. V'yomer alehem Yosef, and Joseph said to them, Halo le'Elohim pitronim, it is surely God who interprets, who solves. Sapru na li, please tell them to me. And so the chief cupbearer tells this image of a vine with 3 branches, and branches blossom into grapes, and the Pharaoh's holding a cup in his hands, and in his dream, the chief cupbearer squeezes with his own hands those grapes into the glass. And Joseph interprets as follows. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will pardon you. You will be restored to your post. And now, verse 16, the chief baker, he's the other dignitary, the other VIP, he sees how favorably Joseph had interpreted. So he now begins to tell him his dream. And he says, there were 3 open work baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of farro that a baker prepares, and the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. Joseph answered, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale you on a pole, and the birds will pick your flesh. On the 3rd day, verse 20, Pharaoh's birthday, he made a banquet for all his officials, and he singled out the chief cupbearer and his chief baker from the officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his work, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Now, I had always read this as kind of a miracle, that Joseph had a vision, that Joseph had this gift of interpretation as a prophecy that flowed through him. For that is how it's most commonly. And so I want to share with you a book by Joel Kovitz called The Visions of the Night, a study of Jewish dream interpretation. Joel Kovitz earned his accreditation as a Jungian therapist at the Carl Jung Institute by translating a book called Pitronot Cholamot, which translates as The Interpretation of Dreams. It's a book written by a man named a Rabbi, Shlomo Almoli, who was born in Spain in 1485, was then exiled. And he wrote a book about dream interpretation, and it is no less than cited as a footnote in Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, where Freud will say, dream interpretation among the Jews has been discussed by Almoli, and he puts in parentheses 1848, but indeed this goes back to the 1500s. So, to do something a little bit different, I'm going to read from you, not a lot, 2 pages, from Pitronot Cholomot, this text written in the 15th century on Joseph's power. One should always bear in mind that the rules governing dream interpretation must be based in part upon a prior detailed knowledge of the dreamer's individual circumstances. The process of divining the future of the dreamer thus involves not only the interpreter's skill, but also his special knowledge of the dreamer's life, with all its implications. And in addition, what the interpreter has conjectured should be consistent with the illusions presented by the dream. The ability to accomplish this is given only to persons destined to provide advice and assistance to others, to enlighten the ignorant. Behold that the person who possesses this intuitive power brings together past, present, and future so that they coincide with the suggestions embodied by the dream. You must furthermore have the intellectual capacity to comprehend allegory and the often enigmatic words of the sages of the past, and bring the powers to bear on the reading of the dream's teachings. In the case of Joseph the righteous, his power of intuition was strengthened by his experience in matters of business and in the acquisition of wealth through speculation, knowing infallibly which commodities would rise in value and which would decline. King Solomon of blessed memory had this to say concerning such ability, quoting Proverbs, "The hand of the diligent makes rich." By this measure, Joseph was a phenomenon. Potiphar and his wife observed Joseph's great fortune in all of his undertakings, in the home and in the field. His superiority in the art of intuition is also evident in the advice he gave to Pharaoh, whereby Pharaoh acquired all the wealth of the entire land of Egypt. With this power, Joseph likewise accurately read the dreams of Pharaoh's servants, which could quite plausibly have been interpreted as having the same reading, for the scripture states, "And they dreamed a dream of both of them." Joseph nonetheless gave each his separate interpretation based upon what he knew of them previously from spending time in their company, as well as what he knew of the differences in their professions and their relative closeness to the king. Joseph knew that the butler was closer to the king than the baker, since the butler was always in the presence of Pharaoh when the latter was drinking, while the baker never entered there. Joseph also knew the difference between the offenses for which they had been arrested. These facts were surely known to him, for it is impossible that Joseph, having been imprisoned with them, would not have questioned them on these matters and learned all they had to tell. Consider the words of the rabbis of blessed memory, Midrash Rabbah Vayeshev. A fly was found in the goblet of wine prepared for Pharaoh by the butler, and a pebble in the cake prepared by the baker. This is why it is said, "The butler of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord," implying that they had failed in the duties they performed for Pharaoh, unquote. Therefore, Joseph intuited the punishment that the servant offenses would incur. In the case of the butler, where a fly was discovered in Pharaoh's goblet, he should have been forgiven, as it could not have been in his power to prevent such a mishap from occurring. What could he have done? The fly fell into the goblet all on its own. Joseph therefore pronounced that the butler should be restored to his former position. But in the case of the baker, where a pebble was discovered in Pharaoh's cake, this was clearly due to the negligence of the baker, who should have been more attentive to his professional duties. Joseph thus pronounced that the baker would end up on the gallows. The 3 days within which Joseph predicted the dream would have been fulfilled was plausible, and that he knew that 3 days remained until Pharaoh's birthday, at which time it was customary to call forth all the workers and give them presents and money, as well as to bring up all the prisoners from the dungeon and decree who was to live and who was to die. So Joseph, with his knowledge of these pertinent factors, was capable of recognizing the difference between the two dreams, although they seem to refer to quite similar circumstances. Thus it is with all genuine and wise interpreters. When I read this a while back, it was a whole another way of understanding. Already in the 15th century, know how extraordinary that was. Already in the 15th century, to understand that the ability to understand, to interpret, was a product of knowing the facts of the situation, how parable works, and thereby interpreting a likely outcome. When I read this little piece about Joseph being successful in business, I did think of my conversations with Harry Krebs, who liked to play the stock market. He particularly had an interest in Israeli companies, that he saw in those companies the potential to do well. He was a student of the market. He was a student particularly of the Israeli market, and with an astuteness of being able to evaluate the conditions, was able to prosper in ways that others were not. But he was also, at least, sure, there's more parts to Harry, but the Harry I knew, an engineer, a capacity to be very analytic, to trust in research, to trust in seeing what was before him, and on that basis to think independently. I know he did that in the decisions that I talked to him about. He was very much his own person in how he came to his decisions based on his own research. And so Joseph